In the Cotton Belt of central Alabama, courthouse records from 1848 contain an entry that clerks, it is reported, tried to burn on 3 separate occasions. The document details a transaction that broke no law, yet ignited a scandal so intense that 2 families abandoned estates valued at over $40,000, a fortune exceeding $2 million in today's currency. What rendered this legal arrangement so deeply disturbing that grown men refused to speak its details aloud? The answer lies in a father's desperation, a daughter considered worthless by every standard of her society, and a decision that would ultimately claim 11 lives across 2 counties. The truth was intentionally obscured. Witness testimony contradicted itself under obvious pressure, and certain pages from the investigation were removed so cleanly that archivists believe it was done by someone with access to government files. Before we continue with what happened on the Yancey plantation that spring, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from? I always wonder where our audience discovers these forgotten chapters of American history. Now, let me tell you about Catherine Yancey and the bargain that would haunt Alabama for generations. The scandal that eventually destroyed the Yancey name began with something far more ordinary, a girl nobody wanted. The Yancey plantation occupied nearly 800 acres along the Cahaba River in that fertile stretch of Alabama where cotton grew so thick it looked as if snow had settled permanently across the fields. By 1848, the state had been transformed by King Cotton. With plantations spreading like a stain across former Creek and Choctaw lands, the Yancey family had arrived in 1832, part of that first wave of settlers who saw opportunity in the forced removal of native peoples. They had built their fortune on cotton, their great house on slave labor, and their reputation on the kind of respectability that demanded constant, exhausting maintenance. Thomas Yancey owned 43 enslaved people, a number that placed him firmly in the planter class but well below the aristocratic tier he so desperately wished to join. His wife had died giving birth to their only child, Catherine, in 1828. The girl had grown up surrounded by wealth, yet touched by something that made that wealth meaningless, a visible difference that marked her as fundamentally unsuitable for the only role her society offered women of her class, marriage. Catherine had been born with a severe port wine birthmark that covered the entire left side of her face, a deep purple stain extending from her hairline to her jaw. In an era when physical perfection in women was considered evidence of moral purity, and any deviation suggested divine judgment, Catherine's appearance rendered her unmarriageable. It did not matter that she could read Latin, that she played piano beautifully, or that she possessed her mother's sharp intelligence and dry wit. In the marriage market of antebellum Alabama, she was worthless. Thomas had tried. Between 1844 and 1847, he arranged meetings with 7 potential suitors, each encounter ending in humiliating rejection. The last, a widower from Mobile desperate enough to consider a bride with a substantial dowry, took one look at Catherine and announced he would rather remain alone than bind himself to a woman who bore the devil's thumbprint. Catherine had been 20 years old then, sitting in her father's parlor in a dress that cost more than most Alabama families earned in a year, while a man evaluated her like livestock and found her wanting. After that, something broke in Thomas Yancey. Neighbors noticed he stopped attending church socials, stopped discussing his daughter's prospects, stopped pretending the situation would somehow resolve itself. Catherine, for her part, retreated into the vast Yancey house, spending her days in the library or the music room, visible to the enslaved people who served her but increasingly invisible to white society. The plantation itself ran on the labor of men and women whose names appeared only in Thomas's ledgers and whose lives were valued solely in terms of their productivity. Among them was a man called Samuel. Though his African name had been beaten out of him years before he arrived at the Yancey place, Samuel stood 6'4", possessed physical strength that made him invaluable during harvest, and demonstrated an intelligence that Thomas found both useful and unsettling. Unlike most enslavers, Thomas had allowed Samuel to learn carpentry, reasoning that a skilled slave increased the property's value. It was a purely economic calculation, the kind at which Thomas excelled. What Thomas did not know, what he could not know, because the barrier between master and slave prevented such knowledge, was that Samuel and Catherine had been conducting careful, sporadic conversations for nearly 2 years. It had started innocuously enough, Catherine reading aloud in the library, Samuel repairing a window frame, both pretending the other wasn't there while Catherine's voice filled the room with words from books Samuel wasn't supposed to understand. Over time, these accidental encounters became less accidental. Catherine would mention which room needed repairs, Samuel would work slowly, listening. They never spoke directly, never acknowledged the growing understanding between them. But by early 1848, they had developed something that terrified them both, a genuine connection across a divide their society insisted was absolute. This was Alabama in 1848, a place where the entire social structure depended on maintaining strict boundaries between white and black, free and enslaved, male and female. The state had laws governing every possible interaction, each one designed to prevent exactly what was developing between Catherine and Samuel. For a white woman to acknowledge attraction to an enslaved man wasn't just scandalous, it was literally unthinkable, a transgression that could only be understood as insanity or moral corruption, requiring the most extreme correction. But Thomas Yancey was beginning to think the unthinkable, driven by a desperation that had been building for years. He was 53 years old, watching his daughter approach 30 with no prospects, knowing that when he died, she would be alone in a world that had no place for unmarried women without families to protect them. His brother had already made clear that Catherine would not be welcome in his household. The family reputation, he'd said, couldn't withstand the burden of housing a spinster who served as a visible reminder of bad blood. By March of 1848, Thomas had begun staying up late in his study, drinking imported whiskey and reviewing his options. His ledgers told a clear story: the plantation's value resided in his land and his slaves. Catherine would inherit both, but a woman couldn't run a plantation alone. Society wouldn't permit it, and more practically, she would be prey to every confidence man and scheming overseer in the county. He needed to secure her future, but every conventional path was blocked by her face, by the mark that made her unmarriageable by the standards of their world. On March 17, 1848, Thomas Yancey called Samuel into his study. This was unusual enough to spark anxiety. Enslaved people were never summoned to the master's private rooms unless punishment was imminent. Samuel entered expecting violence, his body already braced against anticipated blows. Instead, he found Thomas seated behind his mahogany desk, looking exhausted in a way that seemed to go beyond physical tiredness. Thomas studied Samuel for a long moment, and then he spoke words that seemed to come from some other reality, some other world where the fundamental rules didn't apply. He told Samuel that he was going to be freed, not immediately, but conditionally. The condition was marriage to Catherine. The silence that followed was absolute. Samuel stood frozen, trying to process words that made no sense. White men didn't free slaves, white fathers didn't offer their daughters to enslaved men. These things didn't happen. They couldn't happen within the logical structure of their world. Thomas kept talking, his voice low and methodical, laying out terms like a lawyer drafting a contract, because that's exactly what this was, a contract that attempted to solve an impossible problem through an unthinkable solution. Samuel would marry Catherine in a private ceremony. After the wedding, he would be freed and given papers documenting his status. Catherine would inherit the plantation upon Thomas's death, but Samuel would manage it, giving orders to the same people who had worked beside him as property. The marriage would give Catherine the social protection of a husband while giving Samuel something he couldn't otherwise dream of: freedom, land, and power. But there was more, details that revealed how carefully Thomas had thought this through, how desperately he needed this arrangement to work. The marriage would not be recorded in any public registry. Samuel would take the surname Cunningham, a common enough name that wouldn't draw attention, and would be introduced to necessary parties as an overseer from Georgia. The story would be that Thomas had hired him, that Catherine had somehow married this stranger, that everything was normal and proper and explainable. The other enslaved people would be told that Samuel had been sold to Georgia, because if they knew the truth, if they understood that one of their number had somehow crossed the ultimate boundary and married into the master's family, the social order would collapse. The white community would be told as little as possible, and what they were told would be lies stacked upon lies, each one designed to prevent anyone from looking too closely at an arrangement that violated every unwritten rule of Southern society. Samuel's response, when he finally managed to speak, was careful. He asked what would happen if he refused. Thomas's answer was simple and devastating: nothing would happen to Samuel directly, but Thomas would sell himself to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where enslaved people typically died within 5 years. Then Thomas would find another solution, another enslaved man, someone more desperate or less principled. The offer would be made to someone. What Thomas didn't say, but what Samuel understood immediately, was that this wasn't really about Catherine's protection. This was about Thomas's guilt, his desperate attempt to undo the damage of having brought a daughter into a world that had no mercy for women who didn't meet its narrow standards of acceptability. Thomas was trying to buy his way out of his failure as a father, using the one currency he had, a slave's freedom in exchange for taking responsibility for a woman nobody else would have. Samuel asked for time to think. Thomas gave him until sunset. Then he dismissed Samuel with a wave of his hand, the same gesture he'd used 1,000 times before, as if they had just discussed crop rotation or fence repairs instead of fundamentally rewriting the rules of their world. Samuel walked out of that study and directly to the carpentry workshop, where he stood among wood shavings and half-finished furniture, trying to make sense of what had just been offered. Freedom, marriage to a white woman, land, power over people who had shared his bondage, everything he'd dreamed of, wrapped in a package that felt wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He thought about Catherine, about the woman he'd been carefully not thinking about for 2 years, about conversations they'd never quite had and feelings neither could acknowledge. He thought about what it meant to be freed, but only conditionally, only as a favor granted by a desperate father rather than a right claimed by a human being. He thought about explaining to his mother, to his sister, to everyone he'd known in bondage, that he was leaving them behind for a white woman's bed. When Samuel met Catherine that evening, a meeting Thomas had arranged in the library, the room where their strange connection had first developed, she was standing by the window with her back to the door, her posture rigid with tension. She turned when he entered, and for the first time they looked directly at each other without pretense, without the careful fiction that had governed their previous encounters. Catherine spoke first, her voice steady despite the color rising in her unmarked cheek. She told him that she knew what her father had proposed. She also told him, with the brutal honesty of someone who had spent years being evaluated and rejected, that she understood this arrangement offered him something valuable while giving her something she'd never expected to have. She wasn't naive enough to call it love or even real marriage, she called it what it was, a transaction that might benefit them both if they could find a way to make it work. But then she said something that revealed she'd been thinking about this possibility longer than Samuel had, working through implications he was still processing. She told him that if he agreed, he needed to understand what he'd be taking on. He'd be freed, yes, but into a position of permanent suspicion. He'd have papers documenting his status, but those papers would always be questioned by white men who'd assume they were forged. He'd have authority over the plantation's enslaved population, but that authority would come with hatred from people who'd see him as a traitor, as someone who had literally slept his way into the master's house. He'd be neither truly white nor comfortably black, trapped in a middle space that would make him a target for violence from all directions. She also told him, with a directness that bordered on cruel, that she didn't expect love. She didn't expect him to want her or desire her or feel anything beyond the necessary civility required to maintain appearances. What she offered was partnership, a working arrangement between two people society had decided were worthless, finding a way to survive in a world that had no place for either of them. Samuel's response, when it came, was equally direct. He told her he'd agree on one condition, that whatever happened between them, whatever arrangement they made, she would never use her whiteness as a weapon against him. He'd seen what happened when white women accused black men of impropriety, seen men hanged for misunderstandings or deliberate lies, and he wouldn't put himself in that position without assurance. He needed her word that she'd never threaten him, never use the power her skin color gave her to control or punish him. Catherine gave her word. They shook hands, a formal gesture that sealed an utterly informal, completely illegal, thoroughly scandalous agreement. Then Samuel went to find Thomas and give his answer. The wedding took place 3 days later in Thomas's study, with only the three of them present. A Methodist circuit rider, who owed Thomas a substantial gambling debt, performed the ceremony, reading the words quickly and leaving immediately afterward without recording anything in his usual ledger. Thomas had paid him $50, an enormous sum, for his silence and his forgetfulness. Samuel became Samuel Cunningham Freeman, and Catherine Yancey became Catherine Cunningham, wife of a man whose freedom was exactly 20 minutes old. Thomas gave Samuel his papers that same night, documents that described him as born free in Georgia, sold south by destitute parents, and having recently purchased his own freedom through years of skilled labor. The documents were elaborate lies, expensive forgeries that Thomas had commissioned months earlier, suggesting this solution had been in development longer than Samuel had realized. The story given to the enslaved community was simple. Samuel had been sold to a cotton factory in Mobile, a common enough occurrence that nobody questioned it. The story given to white neighbors was barely more complicated. Thomas had hired an overseer from Georgia, a skilled carpenter who'd helped Catherine with renovations. They'd somehow developed affection, married quickly, and Catherine would remain on the plantation under her husband's management. It was unusual but not impossible, scandalous but not illegal, strange but technically explainable. What nobody explained was why Thomas Yancey, known for his careful maintenance of respectability, would allow such a hasty marriage. What nobody questioned was how a carpenter from Georgia had accumulated enough money to present himself as respectable husband material. What nobody examined too closely was whether Samuel Cunningham's papers were genuine, or how he'd learned to read, or why he sometimes forgot to respond to his new name. The first month passed in careful routine. Samuel moved into the main house into rooms that had been prepared for him, sleeping initially in a separate bedroom because neither he nor Catherine were ready for the intimacy their marriage theoretically sanctioned. He began managing the plantation's operations, giving orders to people who had worked beside him weeks earlier, trying to maintain authority while handling the constant, quiet resistance that comes from subordinates who know exactly where you came from. Catherine retreated further into the house, appearing only when necessary, letting Samuel present himself as the public face of the plantation's management. They had dinner together each evening, formal meals where they discussed crop yields and repair schedules and everything except what they were actually doing, what line they'd actually crossed. The enslaved population knew something was wrong. They didn't know what. The story of Samuel's sale had been accepted because there was no reason to question it, but they recognized that the power dynamics had shifted. The white overseer Thomas had employed for years had quit abruptly, citing health reasons but really because he refused to take orders from a man he suspected wasn't quite white enough to hold authority. A new overseer was hired, a drifter from Mississippi who asked no questions and enforced discipline with a casual brutality that Samuel found stomach-turning but couldn't quite prevent without revealing the fragility of his own position. By summer, the arrangement had settled into something almost functional. Samuel and Catherine had developed a working partnership that included careful affection, though whether that affection was real or performed even they couldn't quite determine. They had begun sharing a bedroom, maintaining appearances for the household staff, who now included 2 enslaved women assigned to Catherine's service. What happened in that bedroom remained private, but servants noticed that Catherine seemed less withdrawn, that she sometimes laughed at Samuel's comments, that she touched his arm when speaking to him in ways that suggested genuine comfort. The plantation was performing well under Samuel's management. He'd implemented several improvements, a new irrigation system, rotating crops on some fields to restore soil quality, reorganizing the work schedules to reduce the brutal punishments the previous overseer had favored. The enslaved population remained wary, but the absence of random violence was creating something that might eventually become grudging respect. But in July, something happened that would ultimately unravel everything Thomas had so carefully constructed. A woman named Dinah, who had been enslaved on the Yancey plantation for 15 years, asked to speak with Samuel privately. What she told him in the carpenter's workshop, where he still retreated when he needed to think, was that she recognized him, not just from his time as enslaved labor. She'd known him his entire life. She'd known his mother, who died during a cholera outbreak in 1842. She'd known his sister, who'd been sold south in 1844 to pay Thomas's gambling debts. Dinah told Samuel that she'd been happy to hear he'd been sold to Mobile, had hoped he might find better circumstances there. But then she'd seen him giving orders, had recognized something in his voice or his bearing, had put together pieces that didn't quite fit. She'd realized the Georgia overseer was actually Samuel, somehow transformed from enslaved to free, somehow married to the master's daughter. She didn't know how it had happened, but she knew it had. And she knew that other people in the enslaved quarters were starting to notice inconsistencies, the way Samuel knew too much about the plantation's history, the way he sometimes slipped into familiar patterns with people he supposedly didn't know, the way Catherine looked at him with something that seemed like genuine affection rather than the careful tolerance white wives typically showed hired overseers. Dinah told Samuel that she wouldn't reveal his secret. But she also told him that secrets like this one couldn't last, that someone else would figure it out eventually, and when they did, the consequences would be catastrophic for him, for Catherine, for Thomas, and probably for everyone in the enslaved quarters who'd be suspected of helping conceal the truth. Then Dinah asked Samuel a question that revealed she understood the moral complexity of his situation better than he did. Did his freedom, his marriage to a white woman, his position of relative power, did any of it justify abandoning the people he'd left behind? His sister was still enslaved, still suffering, still property. His mother's grave was unmarked in the corner of the field where enslaved people were buried without ceremony. And here he was, playing master, giving orders to people who could have been his family, protecting his own comfort by maintaining the system that had destroyed everything he'd loved. Samuel had no answer. He told Dinah that he'd think about what she'd said, that he appreciated her discretion, that he understood her anger. Then he asked her to keep quiet a while longer, just until he could figure out what to do. That evening, Samuel told Catherine everything. He told her about Dinah's recognition, about the growing suspicion in the quarters, about the fundamental instability of their arrangement. He also told her about his sister, about the guilt that had been eating at him since he'd accepted freedom while leaving behind everyone he'd known in bondage. Catherine's response revealed something about her own moral development over those months. She told Samuel that she'd been thinking about the same problem, about the injustice of their arrangement, about how her safety had been purchased with his complicity in enslaving others. She'd been raised to accept slavery as natural and right, but living with Samuel, talking with him as an equal, had made those beliefs impossible to maintain. She proposed something that would either solve their problem or destroy them entirely. They should free Thomas's enslaved people. Not all at once, that would attract immediate attention and probably violence, but gradually, through sales to buyers in northern states who'd immediately free them, through claims that certain individuals had earned freedom through exceptional service, through quiet manipulation of documents and careful transportation to places where they could disappear into free black communities. It was illegal, dangerous, and likely to result in their economic ruin if they succeeded and their execution if they were caught. But Catherine argued that they'd already crossed so many lines, had already violated so many fundamental rules of their society, that this violation at least served a moral purpose rather than just protecting their own comfort. Samuel pointed out the obvious problem. Thomas was still alive, still owned the enslaved population, still controlled the plantation. They couldn't act without his knowledge. And Thomas had shown no indication that he felt any moral qualms about slavery itself. His gesture towards Samuel had been personal and pragmatic, not ideological. Catherine's response was simple: they needed to convince Thomas, or they needed to wait until he died and then act immediately on her inheritance. Either way, they needed to prepare, identify safe destinations, make contacts with underground networks that helped escaped slaves reach freedom, build up enough cash reserves to fund transportation. Over the following weeks, Catherine and Samuel began their careful planning. They couldn't discuss it openly, couldn't write anything down, couldn't involve anyone else without risk. But they began making quiet inquiries, testing whether certain boundaries could be pushed, seeing how far they could go without triggering suspicion. In September, Thomas Yancey collapsed during supper. The local physician diagnosed him with heart disease, told him he had perhaps 6 months to live, and recommended rest and minimal exertion. Thomas took the news with surprising calm, as if he'd been expecting it, as if this was just one more piece of bad fortune to be managed. What Thomas didn't expect was how his declining health would shift the power dynamics he'd so carefully balanced. As he grew weaker, Samuel and Catherine assumed more complete control of the plantation. The enslaved population began to understand that Samuel wasn't just an overseer serving at Thomas's pleasure, he was going to be the permanent master after Thomas died. This realization created new tensions, new questions about what Samuel's authority might mean for them. In October, a man calling himself a slave catcher arrived at the plantation, claiming he was tracking a fugitive who matched Samuel's description. He had papers, he said, suggesting that a slave matching Samuel's age and appearance had escaped from a plantation in Georgia 3 years earlier. The papers were obvious forgeries, the dates didn't match, the physical description was too vague. But they didn't need to be convincing, they just needed to be plausible enough to create doubt. Samuel showed the men his freedom papers, the elaborate forgeries Thomas had commissioned. The slave catcher examined them, noted several details that seemed unusual, and suggested that perhaps the matter should be brought before a local magistrate for verification. Catherine intervened, offering the men $50 to verify his records more carefully. The men counted the money, smiled, and left without another word. They'd been extorted, not investigated. But the incident revealed how vulnerable Samuel's position really was. Any white man with minimal creativity could threaten him, could question his papers, could force him to prove his freedom over and over again while draining their resources through bribes and legal fees. More concerning was what happened next. Word of the slave catcher's visit spread through the white community, carried by the overseer who'd witnessed the confrontation. Suddenly, neighbors who'd previously accepted Samuel as a peculiar but legitimate overseer began asking questions. Where exactly in Georgia had he come from? Why were his freedom papers signed by a notary nobody had heard of? Why did an educated northern abolitionist who visited the plantation in November, looking to purchase cotton, comment that Samuel's speech pattern seemed more consistent with an Alabama upbringing than Georgia origins? The suspicion was still vague, still unformed, but it was growing. Catherine tried to manage it through social engineering, hosting small gatherings, presenting Samuel as her devoted husband, showing that they were proper and respectable and exactly what they appeared to be. But she couldn't control the whispers, couldn't prevent people from noticing that Samuel seemed too comfortable with enslaved people, too familiar with plantation operations, too knowledgeable about local history for someone who'd supposedly arrived only months earlier. In December, Thomas died. His death was peaceful, attended by Catherine and Samuel, witnessed by the physician who diagnosed his heart condition. The funeral was well attended, with neighbors offering condolences to Catherine and cautious courtesy to Samuel. Thomas was buried in the family plot next to his wife under a headstone that made no mention of his daughter's scandalous marriage or his final desperate attempt to secure her future. Catherine inherited everything as Thomas's will specified: the plantation, the land, the enslaved people, and all associated property. Samuel, as her husband, assumed legal control of her inheritance under Alabama's coverture laws, which stripped married women of independent property rights. Suddenly, the arrangement Thomas had constructed was fully realized. Samuel, born into slavery, now owned the people he'd lived among, worked beside, and loved as family. The situation was impossible and getting worse. The enslaved population had figured out at least part of the truth, and they were angry. They understood that Samuel had escaped bondage through marriage to a white woman while leaving them behind in chains. Some saw him as a traitor, others as someone to be pitted for the impossible position he'd been maneuvered into, but none trusted him. The white community's suspicion had crystallized into active investigation. A group of neighboring planters had hired a lawyer to examine Samuel's freedom papers and Catherine's marriage records, looking for irregularities that might void the arrangement and allow them to claim the plantation through various legal mechanisms. The scrutiny was supposedly about protecting community standards, but it was really about wealthy white men not wanting to accept a black man, freed or not, controlling land and enslaved people. In January of 1849, Catherine made a decision that she hadn't discussed with Samuel, that he never would have approved if she had. She began quietly selling enslaved people to a Quaker merchant from Pennsylvania who'd contacted her after Thomas's death, expressing interest in purchasing field hands for a manufacturing operation in the North. The merchant was part of an underground network that freed purchased slaves immediately upon arrival in Pennsylvania. The merchant's name was Josiah Fletcher, and he'd been doing this work for 7 years, moving through the South with legitimate business credentials that allowed him to purchase enslaved people without arousing suspicion. He'd heard about the Yancey plantation through networks that existed beneath the surface of normal commerce, whispered recommendations from other abolitionists, coded messages in northern newspapers, information passed between free black communities who tracked which white Southerners might be sympathetic to their cause. Fletcher's initial contact with Catherine came through a carefully worded letter discussing industrial labor needs and the quality of Alabama field workers. Catherine understood immediately what he was really offering. She responded with equal care, using language about workers seeking new opportunities and arrangements that might benefit all parties. They met once in late December in the parlor of a Montgomery boarding house where Catherine had claimed to be visiting a sick aunt. Fletcher laid out his terms clearly. He would pay market rates for enslaved people, provide legitimate bills of sale, and transport them north through a series of safe houses that would eventually deliver them to Pennsylvania as free people. The risk was enormous. If discovered, Catherine would face charges of slave stealing, a crime that carried the death penalty in Alabama. Fletcher would be imprisoned or killed, and the freed people would be returned to slavery, probably under much worse conditions than before. But Fletcher told Catherine something that stayed with her. In 7 years of this work, he'd freed over 200 people. Not one had been recaptured. The network was careful, experienced, and committed. Catherine sold 3 people in January, a young couple named Peter and Rachel's brother Marcus. She told them what was happening on the night before Fletcher arrived to collect them. Rachel had cried, not from sadness but from disbelief that freedom might actually be possible. Peter had asked Catherine why she was doing this, what she gained from destroying her own wealth. Catherine's answer was simple: I can't keep doing what my father did. I just can't. The sales were documented as transfers to a cotton operation in Mississippi. Catherine showed Samuel falsified bills of sale afterward, claiming she'd needed to raise cash for plantation expenses. Samuel accepted the explanation because he wanted to believe it, because questioning Catherine too closely meant acknowledging what he suspected she might be doing. In February, Catherine sold 5 more people, including Dinah. This sale was different because Dinah knew the truth about Samuel's origins, because losing her meant losing the one person in the enslaved community who understood the full complexity of their situation. Catherine met with Dinah the night before Fletcher came, in the kitchen house after midnight, and told her everything about the network, about Pennsylvania, about the freedom waiting at the end of a terrifying journey north. Dinah's response surprised Catherine. She wasn't grateful or relieved, she was angry. She told Catherine that freedom for a handful of people didn't change the fundamental evil of the system. That selling some while keeping others was just choosing who to save and who to abandon. She asked Catherine what gave her the right to decide who got freed first, who had to wait, who might never get chosen at all. Catherine had no good answer. She told Dinah that she was doing what she could, that freeing everyone at once would trigger immediate investigation, that gradual sales were the only way to avoid detection. Dinah replied that gradual sales meant someone always remained enslaved, someone always drew the short straw, someone always had to watch others leave for freedom while staying behind in bondage. They argued for over an hour, voices rising despite the need for secrecy, each woman defending a position that made sense from her perspective but looked monstrous from the others. Finally, Dinah told Catherine she'd accept freedom because refusing it wouldn't help anyone, but that Catherine shouldn't expect forgiveness or gratitude for fixing a problem white people had created in the first place. The conversation shook Catherine badly. She'd been thinking of herself as morally courageous, as someone taking real risks to do the right thing. Dinah's anger forced her to recognize that her courage still came from a position of power, that even in liberation she was exercising control over black lives, deciding fates according to her own judgment rather than allowing people to determine their own paths. But she continued the sales, accelerating them through March and April, 7 people in March, 9 in April. Each sale followed the same pattern, late-night conversation revealing the truth, emotional reactions ranging from joy to suspicion to Dinah's angry acceptance, Fletcher's arrival with cash and forged documents, and then the careful journey north, beginning with a wagon ride to Montgomery disguised as a normal commercial transfer. Samuel discovered the plan in late April when a woman named Sarah told him what was happening. Sarah had been selected for the next group leaving in May, and she'd come to Samuel because she had a question. Should she trust Catherine, or was this some elaborate trap designed to identify people willing to escape so they could be punished as examples? Sarah's suspicion made sense. Enslaved people lived in constant awareness that trust could be weaponized against them, that apparent kindness might be a test designed to justify cruelty. She'd seen people punished for expressing desire for freedom, had watched the system turn slaves against each other through strategic rewards and punishments. Why should she believe that Catherine Yancey's daughter was actually helping rather than gathering evidence of disloyalty? Samuel's response revealed how much he'd changed over the past year. He told Sarah the truth about his own origins, about his marriage to Catherine, about Thomas's desperate solution and its unexpected evolution into something resembling genuine partnership. He told her that he'd been born on this plantation, that his mother was buried in the unmarked cemetery past the south field, that he understood her suspicion because he'd lived with the same fear every day of his enslaved life. Then he told her that yes, she should trust Catherine, that the risk was real but so was the offer of freedom, that he'd stake his own life on Catherine's sincerity. He also told her something more complicated, that Catherine was doing this partly out of genuine moral conviction and partly out of guilt, and that those motivations were so tangled together that probably Catherine herself couldn't separate them. But the motivation mattered less than the result, and the result was freedom for people who'd never expected to taste it. Sarah left that conversation planning to accept Catherine's offer. But Samuel remained troubled, not by the plan itself but by his exclusion from it. Catherine had been making these decisions alone, taking enormous risks without consulting him, operating as if his partnership in their marriage didn't extend to matters this serious. That night, he confronted her. The argument that followed was the first real fight of their marriage. Samuel accused Catherine of treating him like a child, of making decisions that affected both of them without seeking his input. Catherine responded that she'd been protecting him, that if the plan failed, she wanted him to be able to claim ignorance, to have a chance at survival even if she was caught. Samuel shot back that her protection was just another form of control, that she was still thinking like a white woman managing black lives rather than a partner sharing power with an equal. Catherine countered that his freedom was less than a year old, that he was still learning to navigate a world where white authorities looked for any excuse to re-enslave black men, that her caution was realistic rather than condescending. They circled each other's arguments for hours, voices rising and falling, each one speaking truths that hurt because they exposed ongoing inequality in a relationship they'd both wanted to believe was genuinely equal. Finally, exhausted, they reached an agreement. Samuel would become fully involved in planning future sales. They'd make decisions together, and they'd accept that their partnership was still developing, still learning how to navigate the impossible position Thomas had created for them. Over the following months, Catherine and Samuel worked together to accelerate the sales. They grew bolder, selling people in larger groups. The plantation's enslaved population dropped from 43 to 22 by August, then to 15 by October. Each sale required careful planning, coordinating with Fletcher's travel schedule, creating plausible documentation, preparing people for the dangerous journey north, and managing the reactions of those who remained behind, watching others leave for an uncertain freedom while their own liberation remained theoretical. The emotional toll was crushing. Catherine and Samuel were essentially playing God, choosing who got freed and in what order. They tried to prioritize families to keep people together rather than separating them. But logistics didn't always allow for ideal choices. Sometimes they had to send individuals alone because Fletcher could only transport small groups safely. Sometimes they had to delay freeing someone because that person's sudden absence would draw too much attention. The people who remained grew increasingly resentful. They understood what was happening. The attempted secrecy had failed completely, and they watched their community dissolving as others disappeared north. Some were grateful to Catherine and Samuel, seeing them as liberators working within impossible constraints. Others saw them as arbitrary rulers, deciding fates according to unknown criteria, no better than the slave-owning class they'd supposedly rejected. One man named Isaiah confronted Samuel in August, demanding to know why he'd been passed over 3 times while others were freed. Samuel's explanation, that Isaiah's carpentry skills made him valuable to maintaining plantation appearances, that his absence would trigger investigation, sounded like justification for exploitation, even though it was technically true. Isaiah responded that freedom delayed was freedom denied, that staying enslaved to protect someone else's liberation was just another form of sacrifice demanded from black people for white people's benefit. Samuel had no counterargument because Isaiah was right. The strategic necessities of their plan required some people to remain enslaved longer while others went free. That reality was unjust even when it was necessary, harmful even when it was unavoidable. All Samuel could offer was a promise: Isaiah would be in the next group leaving, regardless of the risk to their cover story. But promises became harder to keep as external pressures mounted. The neighboring planters had noticed the declining workforce, had noticed that a plantation that size couldn't function profitably with only 15 enslaved workers. The lawyer they'd hired to investigate Samuel's freedom papers shifted focus to Catherine's sale records, trying to determine where the enslaved people were actually going. The lawyer's name was Harrison Griggs, and he was thorough. He started requesting documentation from the buyers Catherine had listed on her bills of sale. Most were fictitious names attached to fabricated operations in Mississippi and Georgia. When those buyers failed to respond to inquiries, Griggs began visiting the plantations Catherine claimed to have sold to, discovering that none of them had purchased workers from the Yancey estate. By October, Griggs had assembled enough evidence to approach county authorities. He presented documentation showing that Catherine Yancey Cunningham had falsified sale records for at least 28 enslaved people, claiming to sell them to buyers who didn't exist or who denied purchasing anyone from her estate. The implication was clear: the enslaved people had either been freed illegally or they'd escaped with Catherine's help, or both. The sheriff initially hesitated to pursue the case. Catherine was white, from an established family, and technically within her rights to sell her property. But Griggs pointed out that falsifying sale records constituted fraud, that aiding fugitives violated federal law, and that Catherine's actions threatened the entire economic structure of the cotton economy. If white property owners could simply free their slaves without consequence, the whole system collapsed. More damaging was the rumor Griggs carefully spread through white society, that Catherine hadn't just freed enslaved people, she'd done it because her marriage to Samuel Cunningham had corrupted her racial loyalty. She'd betrayed her class and race by marrying a man Griggs strongly suspected wasn't actually born free. And now she was compounding that betrayal by destroying white wealth to benefit black freedom. The argument was explicitly about protecting white supremacy, and it worked because that's what the system was designed to protect. The pressure intensified through October. Catherine and Samuel knew they were running out of time. They accelerated their plans, arranging for Fletcher to return in early November for a final large group. They would free the remaining 15 people all at once, then flee north themselves before authorities could move against them. But they'd waited too long. On November 11th, one of the enslaved people Catherine had freed 8 months earlier was recognized by a slave catcher in Philadelphia. The man, named Benjamin, had been living openly as a free worker in a textile mill using papers Fletcher's network had provided, documenting his birth as a free person in New York. But the slave catcher had been specifically looking for fugitives from Alabama, working from descriptions provided by Griggs, who'd suspected that freed slaves from the Yancey Plantation might surface in northern cities. Benjamin was arrested, questioned, and threatened with return to slavery under the Fugitive Slave Act. The interrogation was brutal, hours of threats and manipulation designed to break his resistance. Eventually, terrified and believing he had no choice, Benjamin revealed that he'd been freed by Catherine Cunningham of Alabama, that she'd sold him to a Quaker merchant who'd transported him north and given him freedom. The information traveled back to Alabama within days, carried by Griggs himself, who'd gone to Philadelphia specifically to verify his suspicions. He returned with Benjamin's signed statement, with descriptions of the Quaker merchant, and with enough evidence to secure arrest warrants for Catherine and Samuel on charges of slave stealing, conspiracy to aid fugitives, fraud, and violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. On November 18, 1849, Sheriff James Hartwell arrived at the Yancey Plantation with a warrant for Catherine's arrest. Samuel was named as a co-conspirator. They had 3 hours to gather evidence for their defense before being transported to the county jail. The sheriff brought 4 deputies with him, expecting resistance or escape attempts. Instead, he found Catherine and Samuel sitting in the parlor as if they'd been waiting for this moment. Catherine was reading, Samuel was reviewing crop reports. They both looked up when Hartwell entered, and neither seemed surprised. Hartwell read the charges aloud, his voice carrying the formal tone required by law but also something else, a note of discomfort that suggested even he found this arrest troubling despite its legality. When he finished, Catherine asked a single question, "May we have time to put our affairs in order?" Hartwell granted them 3 hours, a courtesy he later claimed was standard procedure but which actually reflected his ambivalence about arresting a white woman from an established family. He stationed deputies at all exits to prevent escape, then waited in the entrance hall while Catherine and Samuel prepared for imprisonment. They used those 3 hours with strategic precision. First, they burned documents. Catherine had kept careful records of everyone she'd freed, names, dates, destinations, and contacts in Fletcher's network. She fed these papers into the parlor fireplace, one by one, watching decades of evidence turn to ash. Samuel destroyed correspondence with Fletcher, letters that would have identified other abolitionists in the network, anything that might lead authorities to the people they'd already freed or to others still working to undermine slavery. While documents burned, they also wrote letters. Catherine composed a message to Fletcher warning him not to return to Alabama, that the network had been compromised. Samuel wrote to contacts in Pennsylvania, explaining what had happened and requesting help for the 15 people still on the plantation. These letters would be smuggled out by Sarah, who'd been assigned to serve Catherine until the sheriff arrived, who'd watched everything with wide eyes and finally understood that Catherine and Samuel had never planned to escape. Then Catherine did something that would shape how this story was remembered. She wrote a detailed confession. She titled it, A True Account of Events at the Yancey Plantation, 1848 to 1849, and she filled 16 pages with everything: Thomas's arrangement of her marriage to Samuel, Samuel's origins as an enslaved person on the plantation he'd briefly owned, their decision to use her inheritance to free people rather than profit from their bondage, the network that had helped them, the reasons they'd violated laws they'd been raised to consider sacred. The confession was remarkable for its honesty and its careful legal positioning. Catherine took full responsibility for every decision, describing Samuel as someone who'd questioned her choices more often than he'd supported them. This was partly true. Samuel had been more cautious than Catherine throughout their liberation efforts, but it was also strategic positioning designed to protect him from the harshest consequences. More significantly, Catherine's confession explored the moral reasoning behind their actions. She wrote about growing up believing slavery was natural and right, about how marriage to Samuel had forced her to see enslaved people as fully human rather than property, about the impossibility of maintaining her old beliefs while sharing daily life with someone who'd experienced bondage. She described the gradual moral awakening that had led to her decision to free people, framing it not as political activism but as personal moral necessity. The confession also contained Catherine's interpretation of her father's final act. She argued that Thomas had arranged her marriage to Samuel out of desperation, yes, but also out of some dim recognition that the racial boundaries their society maintained were artificial and cruel. By giving his daughter to an enslaved man and freeing that man through marriage, Thomas had performed a revolutionary act, even if he hadn't fully understood its implications. Catherine suggested that her subsequent actions were simply following her father's logic to its natural conclusion. If racial boundaries could be crossed in marriage, why not in other areas of life? This interpretation was generous to Thomas, who'd probably just been solving a personal problem rather than making a political statement. But Catherine needed her confession to reach audiences who might be sympathetic, and framing her actions as filial duty rather than radical activism made them more palatable to readers who respected family loyalty even when they opposed abolition. When Catherine finished writing, she signed and dated the confession, then gave it to Dinah with specific instructions. The document should remain hidden unless Catherine and Samuel were executed. If they died, Dinah should give the confession to Northern journalists or abolitionists who might use it to argue against slavery. If Catherine and Samuel somehow survived, the confession should be destroyed to protect the people mentioned in it. Catherine also gave Dinah something else, papers documenting her freedom, backdated to look like Thomas had freed her before his death. The papers were obvious forgeries. Catherine wasn't skilled at legal documentation, but they might provide some protection if Dinah could escape north before authorities examined them too closely. Along with the papers, Catherine gave Dinah $50, the last of the cash reserves she hadn't spent on freeing people. Dinah accepted the papers and money with the same complicated expression she'd worn months earlier when Catherine first told her about Fletcher's network: gratitude mixed with anger, appreciation mixed with resentment, acknowledgement that Catherine was trying to help tempered by awareness that this help came from someone who'd inherited the wealth and power that had enslaved Dinah in the first place. Their final conversation was brief. Dinah told Catherine that she'd keep the confession safe, that she'd honor Catherine's instructions about when to release it. Then she said something that seemed to cost her significant effort: "You did better than most. That matters even if it wasn't enough." Catherine had no response to that. She just nodded, then turned away before emotion could overwhelm the careful control she'd been maintaining since Sheriff Hartwell arrived. Samuel spent his final hours in freedom walking the plantation grounds, saying goodbye to places that held complicated memories. He visited the field where his mother was buried in an unmarked grave, standing for long minutes in silence over ground that held people who died in bondage, whose names were forgotten, whose lives were reduced to entries in Thomas Yancey's ledgers. He visited the carpenter's workshop, where he'd first processed Thomas's impossible offer, where he'd learned to be free while surrounded by enslaved people, where he'd built furniture for a house he'd once served. He also spoke with each of the 15 people who remained enslaved on the plantation, apologizing for failing to free them before being caught, trying to explain why some had been freed while others remained. These conversations were painful for everyone involved. Some people accepted his apology with grace, understanding that Catherine and Samuel had done more than most white Southerners would ever consider. Others responded with bitterness, pointing out that Samuel's apology meant nothing while they remained in chains. Isaiah, the carpenter who'd confronted Samuel months earlier about being passed over for freedom, had the hardest words: "You got to be free for a year. Got to live in the big house, give orders, sleep beside a white woman, and pretend you were just as good as any white man. That's more than most of us ever get. So don't apologize for getting caught. Apologize for believing that temporary freedom was enough, that freeing some of us justified leaving others behind." Samuel tried to explain that he'd always planned to free everyone, that getting caught had interrupted the process rather than ending it, but Isaiah cut him off. "Plans don't matter. Results matter. And the result is that 28 people are free and 15 are still slaves, and you're acting like you did something noble instead of just choosing who to save and who to abandon." The accusation stung because it was fundamentally true. Samuel and Catherine had chosen who got freed and in what order, making decisions that determined who would taste freedom and who might die enslaved. Those decisions had been necessary. Freeing everyone at once would have triggered immediate investigation, but necessity didn't make them just. It just made them required. When the 3 hours expired, Sheriff Hartwell found Catherine and Samuel waiting in the entrance hall, dressed for travel, carrying nothing except a small bag containing clean clothing. They went peacefully to the wagon that would transport them to the county jail, climbing in without protest or dramatic statements. As they left, Sarah and several other enslaved people watched from the windows of the main house, their expressions unreadable. The county jail was a squat brick building in the center of town, built to house criminals awaiting trial. Catherine and Samuel were placed in separate cells initially, county policy dictating that men and women be housed apart. But after Catherine's lawyer, a young man named Douglas Kemp who'd been appointed because Catherine had spent all her money freeing people, argued that separating a married couple served no purpose, they were moved to a larger cell they could share. The cell was 10 by 12 feet with a single barred window, 2 narrow beds, and a bucket for sanitation. It was cleaner than cells used for black prisoners, who were typically held in a basement area with no windows and minimal ventilation. Even in jail, racial hierarchy persisted. They spent their first night in silence, each processing what was coming. The trial would be perfunctory, the evidence against them was overwhelming, and neither planned to deny what they'd done. The sentence would almost certainly be death. Alabama law prescribed execution for slave stealing, and what they'd done was textbook violation of that law. Catherine broke the silence around midnight, speaking into the darkness of their cell. "Do you regret it?" Samuel's answer came after a long pause. "I regret that we didn't move faster. I regret that 15 people are still enslaved because we were too careful, too worried about getting caught. But I don't regret trying." They talked through the night, reviewing decisions and choices, examining paths not taken. They discussed whether they should have freed everyone immediately after Thomas's death, accepting the certainty of quick capture in exchange for complete liberation. They discussed whether Samuel should have refused Thomas's original offer, remained enslaved, perhaps attempted escape north rather than accepting freedom through marriage. These conversations were ultimately pointless. The past couldn't be changed, but they needed to process their choices, needed to examine whether they'd done the right things or just the expedient things, needed to determine whether their actions had been genuinely moral or just selfishly disguised as morality. Around dawn, Catherine articulated something both of them had been thinking but neither had said aloud. "We're going to die because we tried to be good while trapped in something evil. And the evil will continue after we're dead, and the people we freed might be recaptured, and everything we tried to do might end up meaning nothing." Samuel's response was quiet but firm. 28 people got to taste freedom. That's not nothing. Even if they're all recaptured tomorrow, they'll have had days or weeks or months of being free. They'll have known what it feels like to make their own choices, to walk away from cruelty, to imagine futures they control. That matters, even if it doesn't last. It was the most optimistic thing either of them could say, and it barely qualified as optimism, but it was what they had. The hope that brief liberation was better than no liberation, that trying and failing was better than never trying at all. The trial began on November 27, 9 days after their arrest. The prosecution was handled by District Attorney Marcus Wellesley, an ambitious man who saw this case as an opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to protecting slavery against internal threats. His opening statement framed Catherine and Samuel not just as criminals but as traitors to their race and region, people who'd violated sacred trusts to serve an agenda that would destroy Southern civilization. Wellesley's case was straightforward and devastating. He presented Catherine's falsified sale records, testimony from Harrison Griggs about his investigation, and Benjamin's statement from Philadelphia describing how he'd been freed. He called neighboring planters who testified about the suspicious decline in the Yancey Plantation's workforce. He presented expert testimony from a document examiner who identified multiple forgeries in Catherine's bills of sale. Most damaging was Wellesley's presentation of evidence about Samuel's true origins. He called witnesses from the enslaved community who testified that Samuel had been born on the Yancey Plantation, that he'd lived as an enslaved person until late 1848, that his sudden transformation into Samuel Cunningham, freeman from Georgia, had been implausible and suspicious. He presented Thomas Yancey's ledger showing Samuel listed as property worth $1,200 through 1848, then mysteriously absent from subsequent records. Wellesley argued that Samuel's freedom papers were fraudulent, that his marriage to Catherine was therefore invalid, and that his entire legal existence was built on forgery and deception. This argument had significant implications. If Samuel had never been legitimately freed, then his marriage was void, which meant Catherine's inheritance was still legally hers alone, which meant Samuel could be re-enslaved and Catherine could be prosecuted without the complication of having a legal husband. The defense strategy was minimal and ineffective. Douglas Kemp, Catherine's appointed lawyer, tried to argue that she'd been manipulated by Samuel, that she'd been seduced or coerced into betraying her race and class. The argument was offensive. It relied on racist assumptions about black men as dangerous corruptors of white women, but it was the only defense that might save Catherine's life. Catherine refused to support it. When Kemp called her to testify in her own defense, she systematically destroyed his strategy by taking full responsibility for every decision. She testified that the idea of freeing enslaved people had been hers, that Samuel had initially opposed it as too dangerous, that she'd made all final decisions about who would be freed and when. She described Samuel as a cautious partner who'd questioned her judgment more often than he'd encouraged her actions. Her testimony was essentially a confession delivered clearly and without apparent remorse. She explained her moral reasoning, describing how marriage to Samuel had forced her to recognize enslaved people as fully human, how she'd come to believe slavery was fundamentally evil regardless of its legality, how she decided to use her inheritance to free people rather than continue profiting from their bondage. When Wellesley cross-examined her, he tried to characterize her actions as irrational, as evidence of mental instability requiring treatment rather than punishment. Catherine rejected this framing completely. She insisted that her actions had been entirely rational, that freeing enslaved people was the logical conclusion of recognizing their humanity, that what appeared insane was actually the system that treated people as property. The exchange between Catherine and Wellesley became heated, with Catherine refusing to accept his characterization of slavery as natural or her actions as criminal in any meaningful moral sense. At one point, Wellesley asked her directly, "Do you not recognize that your actions violated the laws of Alabama and the United States?" Catherine's response was clear, "I recognize that they violated those laws. I don't recognize those laws as just. There's a difference." The courtroom erupted at this statement, with spectators shouting condemnations and the judge pounding his gavel for order. When silence was restored, the judge warned Catherine that continued defiance would result in contempt charges. Catherine said nothing more, but she'd made her position clear. Samuel's defense followed a different strategy. His lawyer, Martin Chase, was a more experienced attorney who'd agreed to take the case because he found it legally interesting rather than out of any sympathy for abolitionism. Chase argued that Samuel had been legitimately freed by Thomas Yancey, that his marriage to Catherine was therefore legal, and that he bore no responsibility for Catherine's subsequent actions beyond failing to prevent them. The argument attempted to create separation between Samuel and Catherine, positioning him as a bystander to her crusade rather than an active participant. It might have worked if Samuel had supported it, if he'd been willing to claim ignorance or helplessness. Instead, when Chase called him to testify, Samuel destroyed the defense just as thoroughly as Catherine had destroyed hers. Samuel testified that he'd known about Catherine's plan to free enslaved people, that he'd actively participated in arranging sales and coordinating with Fletcher's network, that he'd made crucial decisions about who would be freed and in what order. He described the agonizing process of choosing between liberating some people quickly versus moving slowly to avoid detection. He acknowledged the terrible calculus they'd engaged in, deciding that 15 people remaining enslaved while 28 went free was preferable to all 43 remaining in bondage forever. His testimony included something unexpected, a detailed explanation of what slavery had been like from inside. What it meant to be property rather than person, what it did to someone's soul to know they could be sold away from family or beaten for minor transgressions or worked to death for another person's profit. The courtroom fell silent as Samuel described these experiences, not because listeners were sympathetic but because they were shocked that an enslaved person, or formerly enslaved person, or whatever Samuel was, would dare speak such truths in open court. When Wellesley cross-examined Samuel, he focused on attacking Samuel's credibility, suggesting that a man born into slavery couldn't be trusted to tell the truth, that his testimony was inherently suspect because of his racial inferiority. Samuel responded to these attacks with calm precision, pointing out the contradiction in Wellesley's argument. If enslaved people were too inferior to be trusted as witnesses, how could they be held legally responsible as criminals? The question was rhetorical, but it highlighted an inconsistency in Southern legal thinking. The system wanted enslaved people to be simultaneously less than human for purposes of denying rights and fully human for purposes of enforcing punishment. Samuel's question forced the court to confront that inconsistency, even if no one acknowledged it openly. The trial lasted 3 days total. On the afternoon of November 29, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned 2 hours later with guilty verdicts on all charges: slave stealing, conspiracy, forgery, and fraud. The judge asked if either defendant wished to make a statement before sentencing. Catherine declined. Samuel stood and said simply, 28 people are free because of what we did. That's all the statement I need to make. The judge sentenced them both to death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days, the minimum time required by Alabama law to allow for appeals. He also ordered that after execution, their bodies be buried outside consecrated ground, that their graves remain unmarked, and that their names be struck from family records as punishment for betraying their race and society. They were returned to their cell to await execution. The date was set for December 27, exactly 1 month after sentencing. For most of that month, they received no visitors except their lawyers, who made perfunctory appeals that were quickly denied. Douglas Kemp apologized to Catherine for his ineffective defense. Catherine told him there had been no effective defense possible, that the outcome had been predetermined by evidence and social necessity. During those final weeks, Catherine and Samuel settled into strange routines. They played cards with a deck provided by a sympathetic guard. They read books from a small library the jail maintained for prisoners. They talked about their childhoods, about memories and dreams, and all the conversations they'd never quite had during their brief marriage. They were in some ways more genuinely married in that cell than they'd been during their year of freedom, when they'd been so focused on liberation work that they'd barely had time to know each other as people. On December 20th, a week before their scheduled execution, something unexpected happened. Josiah Fletcher appeared at the jail requesting permission to visit Catherine and Samuel as their spiritual advisor. The request was approved, condemned prisoners had the right to religious counsel, and Fletcher was allowed into their cell for an hour. Fletcher brought news from Pennsylvania. The 28 people Catherine and Samuel had freed were safe, scattered across multiple cities and towns, living under new names with documents identifying them as born free. Benjamin had recanted his testimony, claiming he'd been coerced and that his statement was false. Fletcher's network had helped him escape Philadelphia before Alabama authorities could reclaim him. More significantly, Fletcher had been organizing Northern support for Catherine and Samuel. Abolitionist newspapers had published articles about their case, framing them as martyrs to the cause of human freedom. Religious leaders had written letters to Alabama's governor requesting clemency. Pennsylvania's state legislature had passed a resolution condemning Alabama's prosecution of people whose only crime was recognizing the humanity of enslaved people. None of this would actually save them. Alabama wasn't going to release prisoners based on Northern outrage, but it meant their deaths would have meaning beyond their immediate circumstances. They would become symbols, their story would be told and retold, and their sacrifice might inspire others to take similar risks. Fletcher also brought a request from Northern abolitionists. Would Catherine and Samuel agree to have their final letters published after their execution? The letters could reach audiences that needed to understand the moral bankruptcy of slavery, could humanize the abstract debates about bondage and freedom, could demonstrate that the system was so evil that even white Southerners who'd been raised to accept it sometimes came to recognize its fundamental injustice. Catherine and Samuel agreed. They spent the next several days writing letters that Fletcher would carry north, testimonies to be published after their deaths. Catherine wrote about her moral journey from accepting slavery as natural to recognizing it as evil, about the impossibility of being good within systems designed to make goodness impossible, about a hope that future generations would find better solutions than the ones available in 1849. Samuel wrote about what slavery had done to him and his family, about the permanent damage caused by treating humans as property, about the courage required to resist systems that claimed divine sanction and natural law as justification. These letters would eventually be published in multiple Northern newspapers, reaching thousands of readers and contributing to the growing abolitionist movement. But Catherine and Samuel would never know their impact, would never see how their words would be used to argue against the system that was about to kill them. On the evening of December 26th, the night before their scheduled execution, Catherine and Samuel were given their final meal. The jail provided better food than usual: roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from local farms. They ate together, talking quietly about nothing in particular, avoiding discussion of what would happen in the morning. Around midnight, after the guards had completed their final rounds, Samuel asked Catherine the same question she'd asked him weeks earlier: "Do you regret it?" Catherine thought for a long moment before answering, "I regret that we couldn't do more. I regret that 15 people are still enslaved. I regret that we're going to die before we're 30 years old. But I don't regret trying to be better than we were raised to be." They held each other through the remaining hours of darkness, waiting for dawn and what it would bring. At dawn on December 27th, guards came to prepare them for execution. But what happened next remains disputed, buried in contradictory evidence and official reports that don't align with witness testimony. The official record states that Catherine and Samuel were found dead in their cell at sunrise, having consumed poison smuggled into the jail sometime during the previous evening. The jail physician examined their bodies and concluded they died from arsenic poisoning, probably administered in wine that had been delivered as part of their final meal. But several elements of this official narrative don't quite make sense. The wine had been inspected by guards before being delivered, and none reported noticing anything unusual. The bodies showed signs of arsenic poisoning, severe stomach pain, vomiting, convulsions, but also showed bruising consistent with physical struggle. The cell door was found unlocked, which shouldn't have been possible if they died by their own hand. Unofficial accounts, whispered among jail workers and eventually recorded by a northern journalist who investigated the case years later, tell a different story. These accounts suggest that Catherine and Samuel were killed by county officials who wanted to avoid the spectacle of publicly hanging a white woman for the crime of freeing slaves. A public execution would have attracted attention, would have required officials to explain exactly what crime justified Catherine's death, would have forced the community to confront the moral implications of executing someone for acting on conscience rather than self-interest. Poison in the cell was cleaner, easier to explain, and allowed authorities to present Catherine and Samuel's deaths as voluntary rather than state-sanctioned murder. It preserved the fiction that they'd recognized the evil of their actions and chosen death over public shame. A third theory, supported by fragmentary evidence and persistent rumors, suggests that outraged citizens broke into the jail and killed Catherine and Samuel before official execution could occur. This theory is based on witness reports of unusual activity around the jail on the night of December 26, of men gathering in small groups and dispersing quickly when questioned, of guards who seemed unusually distracted during their final rounds. This version suggests vigilante justice, private revenge carried out by people who believed Catherine and Samuel deserved worse than official execution. The bruising on their bodies, the unlocked cell door, the conveniently timed suicide, all these elements support this interpretation. The truth is probably some combination of these theories, a messy reality that official records had to simplify into a clean narrative. What's certain is that Catherine and Samuel died in that cell on December 27, 1849, and that their deaths were presented as voluntary suicides to avoid complications that would follow from more honest accounting. Their bodies were buried that same day before sunset in unmarked graves outside the county cemetery. The location was deliberately obscured. No one wanted their graves to become pilgrimage sites for abolitionists or rallying points for people who might sympathize with their cause. The few people who attended the burial were sworn to secrecy about the exact location. The 15 enslaved people who remained on the Yancey plantation when Catherine and Samuel were arrested were sold at auction to settle the estate's debts. The auction occurred on January 4, 1850, less than 2 weeks after Catherine and Samuel's deaths. The people were sold individually rather than as families, scattered across multiple buyers, their fates unknown and unrecorded. But the 28 people Catherine and Samuel had managed to free remained free. Pennsylvania authorities refused to cooperate with Alabama's attempts to recover them, citing technical problems with extradition requests. Fletcher's network helped them establish new identities and find work in northern cities. Some eventually joined the abolitionist movement, speaking publicly about their experiences in slavery and their liberation through Catherine and Samuel's efforts. Their testimonies contributed to the growing northern opposition to slavery, providing human faces to abstract political debates. Dinah, who'd received freedom papers from Catherine, made it north safely. She settled in Philadelphia, working as a seamstress and eventually marrying a freeman who'd been born in New Jersey. She kept Catherine's confession hidden for 30 years, exactly as instructed. In 1879, she gave it to William Lloyd Garrison, Jr., a journalist investigating the history of slavery in Alabama. Garrison published excerpts in his newspaper, causing a brief scandal and renewed debate about the Yancey case. The confession's publication prompted several responses. Some northern readers praised Catherine and Samuel as martyrs to human dignity. Some southern readers dismissed the confession as abolitionist propaganda, claiming it was fabricated or heavily edited to serve political purposes. Historians debated its authenticity, questioning whether anyone could really have crossed so many boundaries in pursuit of something resembling justice. But the confession's core details aligned with other evidence: trial testimony, courthouse records, witness statements. The basic facts were undisputed. Catherine Yancey had married an enslaved man freed by her father, had inherited a plantation, and had used that inheritance to free people rather than profit from their bondage. She and her husband had been caught, tried, and executed. The moral interpretation of these facts remained contested, but the facts themselves were real. The Yancey plantation was sold at auction in February 1850. The buyer was a cotton merchant from Mobile named Charles Thornberry, who transformed it into one of the largest operations in the county. Thornberry worked the land hard, purchasing additional enslaved people and maximizing cotton production. The plantation remained profitable until Union forces occupied the area during the Civil War, when enslaved people left en masse, making continued operation impossible. The main house burned in 1868 in a fire that was never properly investigated. Some blamed the fire on former enslaved people taking revenge on a site of their oppression. Others suggested it was burned by former Confederates angry about losing the war. The real cause was probably mundane, electrical problems or abandoned stoves, but the symbolic interpretations persisted. After the fire, the land was subdivided and sold to multiple buyers. The old Yancey plantation ceased to exist as a distinct entity, absorbed into other properties, erased from maps as a specific location. The places where Catherine and Samuel had lived, where they'd made their impossible marriage work, where they'd planned liberations and watched some people go free while others remained behind, all of it was plowed under, built over, forgotten by everyone except historians and descendants of the people whose lives had been briefly transformed by two people's desperate attempt to be good within a system designed to make goodness impossible. Today, nothing marks where Catherine and Samuel are buried. Nothing marks where Thomas constructed his desperate solution to Catherine's unmarriageability. Nothing marks where 28 people were freed through illegal sales before the system caught up with them and reasserted its control. The land holds no memorials, no historical markers, no acknowledgement that any of this happened. The story survives only in fragments: Catherine's confession in a Massachusetts historical society, trial testimony in courthouse records that are difficult to access and rarely examined, whispered family histories among descendants of people who were freed or who remained enslaved. Most Americans have never heard of Catherine Yancey or Samuel Cunningham, have no idea that someone once tried to solve the problem of slavery through marriage and liberation rather than through politics and war. But the people they freed remembered. Descendants of those 28 people carried stories forward through generations, telling children and grandchildren about the white woman who'd given up everything to free black people, about the freed slave who'd briefly become a master and then used that position to liberate others. These stories got simplified and mythologized over time, but they preserved the core truth. Some people chose to resist slavery even when resistance meant death, chose to be good even when goodness was illegal, chose to cross boundaries even when society insisted those boundaries were absolute and natural and divinely ordained. The moral of the story, if there is a moral, remains unclear. Catherine and Samuel tried to solve an impossible problem and failed. Most people they tried to help remained enslaved. They themselves were caught and killed. The system they tried to undermine continued for 16 more years until military force finally broke it. Their sacrifice changed almost nothing in immediate practical terms. But maybe that's not the right way to measure moral action. Maybe trying to be good matters even when it fails. Maybe choosing resistance over complicity means something even when resistance is futile. Maybe crossing boundaries that shouldn't exist is valuable even when society punishes you for it. Maybe 28 people tasting freedom is worth 2 people's lives, even if the 28 couldn't have chosen that trade themselves. Or maybe the whole story is just tragedy, 2 people trapped in impossible positions, making desperate choices that hurt almost everyone involved, dying without solving anything. Maybe there's no moral, no lesson, just the historical fact that these events happened and then were forgotten, survived only in documents most people never read and stories most people never hear. What remains certain is that the lines Thomas Yancey tried to cross, between enslaved and free, black and white, property and person, are still being negotiated, still causing pain, still requiring choices that shouldn't have to be made. Slavery ended, but its consequences persist. The boundaries were legally abolished, but they survive in practice. The system was officially dismantled, but its logic continues to shape how Americans think about race, power, and human value. Catherine and Samuel crossed those lines briefly, paid for that crossing with their lives, and left behind a record that some people tried to destroy while others tried to preserve. Their story didn't change history, but it reveals something about what history was, about the human costs of systems that treated some people as property, about the impossibility of being innocent within structures designed to distribute guilt widely, about the courage required to choose resistance when survival demands complicity. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps we can't ask more from history than that it show us what people did when trapped in impossible situations, show us the choices they made and the consequences they faced, show us the boundaries they tried to cross and the prices they paid for crossing. Catherine and Samuel tried to be better than they were raised to be. They failed more than they succeeded. They died young and scared and probably full of regrets. But they tried. And that trying is worth remembering even when we can't quite determine what it means or whether it mattered or if any of us would have the courage to make similar choices when faced with similar circumstances. What do you think about this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? The historical record is incomplete. Documents were destroyed, and different people remembered events differently. Maybe there are pieces we'll never know, truths that died with Catherine and Samuel, secrets buried in unmarked graves outside a county cemetery whose exact location has been forgotten. If you're intrigued by these forgotten chapters of American history, stories that complicate our understanding of the past and force us to confront uncomfortable truths about systems we've inherited, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates history that doesn't fit neat moral categories, who understands that the past was messy and complicated and full of people trying to navigate impossible choices. Leave a comment telling me what you think. Did Catherine and Samuel make the right choices, or were they doomed from the start by agreeing to participate in Thomas's desperate scheme? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious how different people interpret these events. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark corner of American history that most people have never heard about.